Very rarely did emperors come along who really reshaped the Roman world. Augustus, the first of them, was one. Few of his successors in the first centuries came close to his impact. Then, after 3 centuries, 2 transformative men ruled in quick succession. Emperor Diocletian, the mastermind behind the Tetrarchy, and Emperor Constantine, the first Christian to rule the empire. In their own ways, both were to decisively reshape the world they had been born into. That was the world of the 3rd century, an age of crises and upheavals. Like so many emperors of the 3rd century, Diocletian was acclaimed by the army in 284, and had to defeat a rival before his sole rule of the empire was secure. Almost immediately, the new emperor took a different approach to ruling. He recognised the difficulty of ruling alone, so in the following year Diocletian raised up a fellow army officer, making him Augustus of the West in 286. This was Maximian. In a sense, the choice of Maximian was quite brilliant. Diocletian's co-ruler was capable, but remained remarkably loyal. His choice was also radical. The empire had experienced co-rule before, but it had always been between members of the same family. Diocletian was making a conscious effort to do away with dynasty. For 7 years, Diocletian and Maximian ruled together. Yet from the outset, a degree of superiority was assigned to the Eastern Augustus, as was made clear by the nicknames they chose. Diocletian was Jovius, Jupiter, the king of the gods, while Maximian was Herculeus, a mighty Hercules, acting at Jupiter's behest. This system evolved further in 293, when Diocletian and Maximian, the Augusti, each appointed a lieutenant, given the title of Caesar. The Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, was born. Even 2 emperors were not judged to be enough. A revolt had dislodged Britain and northern Gaul from Maximian's control, undermining their regime. In the east, Diocletian's Caesar was a military officer called Galerius, while in the west was Constantius, the father of Constantine. Both Galerius and Constantius were joined to their respective Augustus through marriage, taking the hand of their daughters. The Tetrarchs got to work, with wars blazing in Britain and Syria in 296. Constantius successfully reconquered Britain, while Galerius was defeated at the hands of the Persian king. Diocletian was distracted by a revolt in Egypt in 297, while Maximian held down the fort in the west. Galerius got his own back against the Persians, giving them a walloping and securing a favourable peace treaty in 299. By the dawn of the 4th century, the empire was stronger than it had been in a long time. The rule of 4 divided the workload, allowing emperors to deal with threats wherever they might arise. But the empire was still whole and united. The clearest statements of tetrarchic ideology can be seen in how the emperors presented themselves. The statue of the Tetrarchs, for instance, can be found in Venice. It depicts Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius and Constantius. But who is who? Wearing military dress, the 4 men look identical. There may have been 4 emperors, but all were one. That said, Diocletian retained superiority as the most senior of the emperors. The division of the empire was fluid, with emperors swapping territory as the situation demanded, and Diocletian passed many reforms affecting the whole empire. A codification of Roman law got underway in the 290s, while the imperial government grew ever more active and interventionist. There was a strong moral sense on the emperor's part that the government had to act to improve the lives of its subjects. Provinces were divided, becoming smaller, while the bureaucracy was overhauled to include a group of powerful new officials called Praetorian prefects, who acted as right-hand men to the emperors. The resulting bureaucracy was now much larger than before. 5-year censuses were uniformly introduced across the empire in 296. Some of Diocletian's schemes failed, such as his naive attempt in 301 to impose a maximum price limit across the empire. And soon, the government tried its hand at regulating religion. Rome had long been an empire of many gods, but there was one god in particular whose worship drew Diocletian's ire: the refusal to admit any other gods, including the gods of the imperial cult, the refusal to sacrifice. These were things that, for a traditionalist like Diocletian, made the god of the Christians and his subjects seem subversive and dangerous. So, in 303, an edict of persecution was published across the empire, stripping Christians of their rights and property, and pulling down their churches. The Diocletianic persecution, the so-called Great Persecution, was the worst the Christians ever had it under Roman rule. But its enforcement differed from emperor to emperor. Diocletian and Galerius were the most stringent, but Maximian and Constantius in the west were more lenient. Anyhow, Diocletian was getting old. By 305, he was in his 60s. Most emperors just rumbled on until they popped their clogs, but Diocletian was different. On the 1st of May 305, he laid down his powers and entered retirement. Like so much about Diocletian's project, this was unprecedented. 20 years is a long time to be ruling the Roman Empire, and rest was just as important then as it is now, which is why I'm happy to say this video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. With Manta's innovative sleep masks, getting your full 8 hours or sneaking in those extra naps has never been easier. Thanks to their adjustability, you can ensure that you get 100% blackout. Their high-quality, comfortable feel makes sleeping easier than ever, whether you sleep on your side, back, or front. The Manta sound model lets you listen to music while you sleep, but with no pressure on your ears. They say that Emperor Antoninus Pius, by the end of his reign, was forced to nibble on dry bread all day just to stay awake. If only he'd had a sleep mask from Manta. There's never been a better time to join the pro-nap movement, with their Black Friday sale just around the corner. That's Manta Sleep, and if you visit their website through the link in the description and use my discount code, you'll get 10% off your next product. So a big thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Emperor Diocletian bowed out with one final power play. Maximian, his longest-serving colleague, was forced to retire as well. As events will show, the Western Augustus probably had different plans, but Diocletian wanted his system to pass to the next generation. Would the Tetrarchy survive? In East and West, erstwhile Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, levelled up to the rank of Augustus, while 2 new Caesars were chosen to serve them. These were Severus and Maximinus. The Second Tetrarchy was born, and the following year, 306, the system began to unravel. Constantius died in Britain on the 28th of July 306, having been Augustus of the West for scarcely more than a year. Under the established model, the title of Augustus should have then devolved upon the Caesar of the West, Severus. But the army in Britain proclaimed Constantius's eldest son, Constantine, Augustus instead. There was then another shock to the system in the autumn, when the city of Rome itself rose in revolt, led by Maxentius, the son of Maximian. Soon the old man had returned from retirement as well, and the two of them, father and son, easily defeated the hapless Severus. The situation in the west continued to move quickly. Late in 307, Galerius invaded Italy, but he underestimated the difficulty of besieging Rome and was obliged to retreat. The following year, Maximian and Maxentius had a falling out, and the father was forced to flee Italy by his son. Maximian remained popular in Africa, which rebelled against Maxentius. Galerius's attempts to restore some order were mostly ineffective. In 308, he appointed a new Augustus of the West, Licinius, but the western provinces were outside of his control. The old players gradually began to leave the stage. One of Galerius's last major decisions, enacted in 311 alongside Constantine and Licinius, was to officially end the great persecution in most of the empire. The only one of the emperors to continue the persecution was Maximinus in the east. With the death of Galerius, there were now 4 emperors once again, but the gloves were off. The stage was set for 2 parallel wars, Constantine versus Maxentius in the west, Licinius versus Maximinus in the east. Constantine allied himself to Licinius by betrothing him to his sister, Constantia. Then, in 312, Constantine launched a blitzkrieg into Italy that culminated in Maxentius's defeat and death outside of Rome. In the east, the showdown between Licinius and Maximinus resulted in the latter's death in 313. Now there were 2, and soon they fell out as well. Constantine invaded Licinius's lands in 316, but despite coming off better, he was not able to decisively defeat his colleague. Peace was restored, with Licinius ceding some of his Balkan lands to Constantine, and the 2 ruled together for 8 more years. Finally, in 324, relations broke down for the final time. Once again, Constantine triumphed, uniting the empire under one emperor for the first time in 4 decades. Now that supreme power was his, what did he decide to do with it? First and foremost, we must turn to religion. Constantine is best known today as the first Christian emperor, and although the exact nature of his evolving beliefs is hard to pin down, he greatly supported the new religion. Stories tell of how the emperor had divine visions before his showdown with Maxentius in 312, of how he commanded his soldiers to inscribe a sign of Christ on their shields. Certainly, Constantine now became more involved in and more supportive of Christianity across the empire. He sponsored big new churches in Rome, issued an edict of toleration alongside Licinius in 313, and, perhaps most importantly, in 314 he convened the first imperially sanctioned council to deal with a Christian controversy in Africa. The emperor was directly involving the state in ecclesiastical affairs, conversely bringing them into the wider public interest. In his dealings with different groups, Constantine rejected extremists in favour of pragmatic factions that could build a moderate Christian consensus. Still, the emperor continued to shroud his views in a fog of ambiguity. The number of Christians had grown over the centuries, but in Constantine's day they were still only a minority of the empire's population. In Rome, the Arch of Constantine speaks only of the prompting of the divinity, while a court rhetorician, writing in 313, referred to a high god in cryptic terms: the divine mind, a certain god. Probably for the benefit of his pagan subjects, Constantine hedged his language. Even his new city of Constantinople was adorned with 3 pagan temples, to Cybele, Tyche, and the Capitoline Triad. Building on the precedent he had established in 314, the emperor called a second, far greater council, which met at Nicaea in 325, to resolve further controversies and attempt to impose the first universal Christian creed. Naturally, not all Christians accepted this new creed, but in attempting to fashion a unified church out of the various Christian communities, Constantine was doing something novel. In 326, the following year, he visited Rome to celebrate his Vicenalia, his 20th anniversary as emperor. Yet he refused to climb the steps to Jupiter's temple, sparking off protests in the city. When, 10 years later, he celebrated his Tricenalia, the emperor had a different city in mind. One of the final decisive engagements in his last war against Licinius had been the siege of Byzantium, which lasted from July to September 324. It was during this siege that Constantine had time to appreciate the natural advantages of the city, which sat on an easily defensible peninsula and straddled key trade routes. Within years, or maybe even months, of his victory, the emperor began major construction work at the site, so that by the 11th of May 330 he could declare a glorious new city in his name. Constantinople, the so-called New Rome. The strategic reasons for founding the city were obvious, both militarily and economically, and the establishment of a gleaming new capital in his name was a powerful way to enshrine his own and his dynasty's prestige. Constantinople would develop into the empire's second greatest city, and for much of the Middle Ages it would remain the greatest city in Europe. Constantine also fine-tuned the administrative system set up by Diocletian, and it's sometimes unclear whether a particular change happened during the reign of the former or the latter. But by the end of Constantine's reign, the imperial administration was basically set for the next 2 centuries. Although the emperor had crushed the tetrarchy beneath his ambitions, he saw value in the idea of co-emperorship. The difference was that this time, dynasty was all. One by one, all of his sons were made into Caesars. Constantine used this roster of sub-rulers to do his bidding, suppressing revolts and fighting foreign foes. Constantine himself, as the victor of several civil wars and the humbler of barbarians everywhere, was a brilliant general, and in 337 he made ready for war against the greatest of Rome's foes, Persia. Marching eastward, the emperor had made it only as far as Nicomedia, when he fell suddenly and deathly ill. For him at least, the end was nigh, so he finally underwent baptism at the hands of the local bishop, and on the 22nd of May, 337, he died. His reign of over 30 years was the longest since Augustus. It was also one of the most transformative since Augustus. In religious terms, the age of Constantine exists in a weird twilight zone. Christians were no longer being persecuted, and the boot was not yet on the other foot. Pagans could still practice freely. By the end of the century, that window had closed. Christianity's dominance, and its central role in the history of Europe, was assured. I want to end with thanks for my supporters on Patreon and YouTube. My 1 Augustus tier patron, Average at Best, my 2 Caesar tier patrons, Moulay Cherkaoui and Diocletian, and my 1 Consul tier YouTube member, Dan Smith. Thank you all very much. Thank you to anyone who's watched this far in the video as well, and I'll see you in the next one.